Hi, I'm Israel Anderson. Welcome to another Table Talk. On this study, we start to look at the temptation of Jesus. Now, some people have actually used this temptation story as evidence that Yahweh is not Satan the adversary. We're going to go through it here. We're going to treat it a little bit like we're looking at it from scratch, without any previous knowledge of who the devil, Satan, might be, and see what does it tell us. I tell you, as I started looking through the temptation, I started to realize something. I started to realize that I think that the only reason that this temptation exists in the Bible is to tell us who the devil really is, and does a very, very good job of identifying the devil. Let's start off by looking at the text. We're just going to read the text, and then we'll start to look at what some other people have said about the temptation. The temptation is in the oldest gospel, which is Mark, and that's all we have, though. The Spirit immediately drove him, Jesus, into the wilderness. He was in the wilderness 40 days, being tempted by Satan. He was with the wild animals, and angels were ministering to his needs. But in Matthew and Luke, we have an extended discourse, 13 verses, and the differences between the two Gospels, Matthew and Luke, are very minor. What we have here is 3 events, and we've got the last 2 events in Matthew that are in the opposite place to what we have in Luke. There's a couple of extra words in Matthew, but other than that, they are pretty much the same. So let's read this and see what happened here in the temptation, and then we'll start to dissect this a little bit. Oh, so where is this? Well, this is Matthew chapter 4, and Luke chapter 4 as well. And I don't have those markers here, but we'll add them on the proper study. So the table talks, if you're new here, are where I get to share with you the preliminaries before we turn things into proper studies. So things are a little bit rough around the edges in the table talks, a little bit more grassroots, down to earth. And but I want to get this as a study as soon as possible because I think this is so compelling. So let's read. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. After he fasted 40 days and 40 nights, he was famished. The tempter, now I'm going to obviously provide some context as we go along here, but the testing of Jesus didn't happen after 40 days, it happened for 40 days. The tempter came and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become bread." But he answered, "It is written, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city, had him stand on the highest point of the temple, and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down. For it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and with their hands they will lift you up, so that you will not strike your foot against the stone." Jesus said to him, "Once again, it is written, you are not to put the Lord your God to the test." Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their grandeur. And he said to them, "I will give you all these things if you throw yourself to the ground and worship me." Then Jesus said to him, "Go away, Satan, for it is written, you are to worship the Lord your God and serve him only." Then the devil left him, and angels came and began ministering to his needs. Now, on this study, I decided what I would do is go back through all the different opinions that Christendom has, the major opinions anyway, that Christendom has come up with over the years. And also we're going to look at some commentary from church fathers and others as well. And what I find is that we get a lot of people kind of giving feedback like, well, maybe you should go and read the church fathers. I think that's always a good idea. You should always read what the church fathers had to say. But I think that as we do that, it's going to be interesting how when we get to the end of the study and we've unpacked everything that is here, um, we can't find anybody that has really noticed all of the things that are actually in here. So some people say that it's the testing of Jesus. The narrative is often seen as a test of Jesus' obedience to God's will. It establishes Jesus as the model of faithfulness, showing that even under severe pressure, he remains committed to God's path. This testing sets the stage for his mission and public ministry. That's good. Jesus as the new Adam. Some interpret the temptation as positioning Jesus as the new Adam. Sorry if you can hear the plane flying overhead. We're near a small airport here. Whereas Adam failed the test in the Garden of Eden, Jesus succeeds in the wilderness, overcoming the devil's temptations and proving his obedience where the first man failed. Yeah, that's good too. Fulfillment of Israel's story. Jesus' 40 days in the wilderness echo Israel's 40 years of wandering. In this view, Jesus represents Israel reduced to one person who recapitulates and redeems the history of Israel, succeeding where Israel faltered, particularly in faithfulness and obedience to God. Okay? Rejection of worldly power. The temptations to turn stones into bread, to throw himself from the temple pinnacle, and to worship Satan in exchange for worldly kingdoms can be seen as rejections of worldly power, glory, and material provision. Jesus' rejections affirm his commitment to spiritual rather than earthly priorities. It's good too. Revealing Jesus' identity and mission. The temptations serve to clarify Jesus' identity and mission. By resisting the devil, Jesus demonstrates his role as the obedient Son of God, committed to the spiritual kingdom rather than earthly dominion. Okay? The model of Christian virtue. For many believers, the story offers a model of how to resist temptation. Jesus' use of Scripture and reliance on God as sources of strength are seen as examples for personal conduct in the face of testing. Now, those are all really good, but here's what I think. I think the story exists to identify the devil. Oh, there's another plane coming overhead. And I think there's some truth to most of these interpretations, but the more I understand the Exodus story, the more the purpose of this story becomes clear to me. The story is to identify the devil plainly and unambiguously. That's what I think the story is for. I think not that it's the only reason that it exists in the text, but I think the primary reason that it exists in the text is not for all of these things, although I think all of those things, they have a lot of crossover there, and I think all of them, most of them anyway, are quite appropriate. But I don't think that's the primary reason that the temptation is included in Matthew and Luke. I think the primary reason is to tell us exactly who the devil is. But let's look at some of the commentary that we get from church fathers and others. Let's see. Because I think it's important to see, we talk about when we look at Matthew 7 and we look at Luke 11, and we see these discourses where Jesus is eviscerating Yahweh for his treatment of the Hebrews, and yet we look back at the church fathers and anyone providing commentary through the ages, and we can't find anyone that's even noticed what Jesus is actually saying in Luke 11, 1 through 13, for example. It's also interesting, this is Luke 4, 1 through 13. It's kind of weird. There's no chapters and verse markers in the actual text. Those are added later. Let's look at John Chrysostom, who said this event shows us that even the Son of God was not exempt from temptation. The temptation was necessary to demonstrate that Jesus was truly human and that he could sympathize with our weaknesses. Okay, Augustine says, He emphasizes the spiritual significance of the three temptations. In his work, The City of God, he draws a parallel between the temptation of Jesus and the struggles of the Israelites during their journey in the wilderness. He highlights the three temptations Jesus faced in the desert: hunger, power, and testing God, and compares them to the temptations the Hebrews faced during the Exodus. Well done to Augustine, who has some idea of what's actually going on here. At least he admits there is a clear connection to the Exodus story. Most of the commentators don't see that at all. Cyril of Alexandria says, he points out that the devil's temptations were aimed at getting Jesus to misuse his divine power. The devil wanted Jesus to perform miracles for selfish reasons rather than for the benefit of others. Okay? And that is probably the case, but no connection to the Exodus. Jerome, who is responsible for creating the Latin Vulgate, which many Bibles are translated from today, emphasizes the importance of Jesus' example in resisting temptation. He notes that Jesus' response to the devil's temptations demonstrate that we must rely on the Bible and resist the temptation to misuse our God-given gifts for selfish purposes. Okay, then we move on to Philo. Philo, in his work on the life of Moses, draws parallels between the Exodus story and the temptation of Jesus, emphasizing the spiritual significance of these events. He sees the Exodus as a symbolic journey of the soul, with the Israelites' struggles in the wilderness representing the trials faced by the individual in pursuit of spiritual enlightenment. Okay? And this is an interesting one, and perhaps the closest that I've been able to find to what I'm going to show you in this study. 12th century Jewish philosopher Moses Maimonides, I should have practiced pronouncing that before I hit record. Maimonides, in his work, The Guide for the Perplexed, draws a parallel between the temptation of Jesus and the trials faced by the Israelites during their journey through the wilderness. He sees the three temptations faced by Jesus as symbolic of the three main challenges faced by the Israelites: the desire for physical sustenance, turning stones into bread; the desire for power and control, ruling over the kingdoms of the world; and the need for spiritual validation, or testing God. In his interpretation, the temptation of Jesus is seen as a continuation of the spiritual journey of the Israelites, emphasizing the importance of transcending the material desires and temptations in order to achieve spiritual enlightenment. It's interesting that a Jewish philosopher is the closest I can find through history that is giving commentary on the temptation to what I'm going to show you today. I think that's kind of interesting. So let's thank all the Founders Club members. You guys are just incredible. It's just a way to support what I'm doing here. We are trying to get to minimum wage here, $2,300. Look, we're now past the halfway mark. I just can't believe this. This is so exciting. Thank you very, very much. And here's the names of the people that have just recently signed up to the Founders Club. Now, I know last week, I think for the first time, we showed two people had subscribed to $100 a month. That's a lot of money. No doubt about that. And now Jay Willio, I'm not sure quite how to pronounce your last name there, but thank you very, very much to all of you for making this possible. Without you, it just would not be possible. Now let's dive into the text. So Luke 4, you could use the version in Matthew. In fact, I'm probably going to switch it over to the Matthew version when I do the full study, just because it includes a word. It includes the word Satanas in Greek, which is Satan, obviously. And whereas the Luke version we're reading here doesn't, I put it in brackets. But we'll probably switch over to the Matthew version just because it's there in the text. What we're going to do here is just break this down, and then we're going to look at the comparisons. I don't want to give too much away. Let's just get into it. Let's just start by reading this. So, then Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, returned from the Jordan River and was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, where for 40 days he endured temptations from the devil. He ate nothing during those days, and when they were completed, he was famished. He was starving. Now, you may look at that and just go, well, wait, what does that tell us? Does that tell us anything interesting at all? When we look at Luke 11, 1 through 13, and we have this long discourse that includes the Lord's Prayer and two stories about the provision of food. And of course, the Lord's Prayer also talks about the provision of food. And of course, this is also talking about the provision of food, and it's no coincidence, right? These are very, very important things. But you may look at that and go, is there any connection here to what happened in the Exodus? Well, let's kind of look at this. We'll break it down a little bit and see. So, the devil versus Jesus. Return from the Jordan River. These are all snippets of that verse. Jesus went through the waters of baptism in the Jordan on his way to the desert to be tested. Okay. Led by the Spirit in the wilderness. Jesus is led by his Father's Spirit into the wilderness for 40 days. So for 40 days, he endured temptations from the devil. The devil tested Jesus in the wilderness. He ate nothing during those days, so Jesus deprived himself of food. When they were completed, he was famished. After 40 days, he was craving food. Now, if you've been looking at all of the stuff we've been, exploring in the Exodus story, and if you haven't, and by the way, if this whole study doesn't seem to have the connections that I'm suggesting it does, then please go back to the beginning of the whole Table Talk series, and that'll bring you up to speed on everything that happened that's pertinent to this anyway during the Exodus. I think the reason that people haven't seen these things before is because most Christians are not very aware of what happened during the Exodus story. And the more you're familiar with that, then the more obvious this is going to become. So let's start to expand this and look at Yahweh versus the Hebrews. We've got the devil versus Jesus. What about Yahweh versus the Hebrews? So Jesus went through the waters of baptism in the Jordan on his way to the desert to be tested. The Hebrews went through the waters of the Red Sea on their way to the desert to be tested. Jesus is led by his Father's Spirit into the wilderness. The Hebrews were led by Yahweh, their Father, into the wilderness. Jesus was tested for 40 days. The Hebrews were tested for 40 years. The devil tested Jesus in the wilderness, and Yahweh tested the Hebrews in the wilderness. Jesus deprived himself of food. Yahweh deprived the Hebrews of food. After 40 days, he was craving food. Jesus was craving food. What do you think the position of the Hebrews was? After 40 years, the Hebrews still craved food, and Yahweh still punished them for crying out for it. That's interesting. Now, may not go through all of these today. Let me just expand all of these real fast. But here I've got passages from the Exodus so we can make these connections. And if you haven't gone through the Exodus story, then perhaps these are going to be very, very important. We'll just read through them really quickly, okay? These are just giving you the reference for where we can find all of these things where Yahweh was dealing with the Hebrews. So the Israelites went through the middle of the sea. We'll find that in Exodus 14. Elohim Yahweh led the people around by the way of the wilderness towards the Red Sea. So that happened for 40 years. And you should remember the whole way that Yahweh, your Elohim, has led you these 40 years in the wilderness. That's in Deuteronomy 8:2. Yahweh tested the Hebrews in the wilderness. For Yahweh, your Elohim, is testing you to know whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul. Deuteronomy 13. Yahweh deprived the Hebrews of food. Yahweh, your Elohim, led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years. He humbled you, causing you to hunger. Deuteronomy 8. After 40 years, the Hebrews still crave food. And here they are still saying, Numbers 21, just before they're about to enter the promised land, Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no bread or water, and we detest this worthless food. Talking about the manna. Well, that's interesting. We've hardly touched the story. We're only 2 verses in, right? Let's see. Where are we right now? We're here. Okay. Then Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, returned from the Jordan River and was led by the Spirit in the wilderness, where for 40 days he endured temptations from the devil. He ate nothing during those days, and when they were completed, he was famished. Now, those connections are pretty solid. And this is just 2 verses out of 13. What are we going to find as we continue to explore all the rest? Sorry for the other plane on top of us here. So, have you ever noticed these things before? I'm finding it very difficult to find anyone that's noticed these things before, yet they're all kind of fairly obvious, right? This is fairly plain. As we continue through this temptation story, it's going to get a lot more specific. Now, remember, we went through Luke 11, 1 through 13, and other than the first verse, which is kind of just a lead in, an introduction, all the other verses completely connect to something happening during the Exodus. Here, I mean, we can just break these 2 verses down and see it's pretty plain what's going on here. So who's the devil? Well, we're going to move on to the next section here on the next episode, where the devil said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command this stone to become bread." And Jesus answered, "It is written, man does not live by bread alone." So thank you for joining me on this new Table Talk series on the temptation. We'll get through this here within about a week, and then I'm going to release this whole thing as a proper study. I think this is very important. And I think that what we're going to discover here is that this whole story of the temptation exists primarily, not solely, but definitely primarily to tell us who the devil really is. And I think as we go through this, you're going to see that fairly plainly too. Thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you on the next one. Share this with somebody that you think should see it. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.